There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died.
April 26, 1986, in the early hours of a spring morning, the world was forever changed. An explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which was under authority of the USSR, sent radioactive particles into the atmosphere, contaminating vast areas across Europe and parts of Asia, and leaving an indelible mark on human history. The Chernobyl disaster was not just a technological failure, it was a failure of responsibility. The rights of the people under the communist government by the disaster were violated in ways that are still being felt today. The roles of governments, institutions, and the global community raised important questions about accountability, justice, and the responsibilities that communist governments held. The Chernobyl disaster raised ethical questions about the right to safety, the right to information, and the responsibility of governments and corporations toward their citizens. In the aftermath, a stark realization spread that the rights of individuals were disregarded for communist secrecy and political expediency. The Soviet Union's initial response was to silence dissent, a decision that violated the basic rights of its citizens to know the dangers they faced. This was not just a failure of technology, but of governance, with no transparent communication regarding the magnitude of the disaster.
His son found him, identified him as Valery Alexeyevich Legasov.
In the wake of Chernobyl, responsibility was a central issue. The Soviet government bore the brunt of the blame for its handling of the disaster and subsequent cover-up. But the question of corporate responsibility also emerged, particularly around the design flaws of the high-pressure reactor and the lack of safety measures. The responsibility for the victims was another difficult question. Some legal battles continue to this day, with victims seeking compensation and acknowledgement for their suffering. At the heart of the Chernobyl tragedy were the people who lived in the shadow of reactor number 4. The nearby town of Pripyat, home of the workers and their families, had a population of about 49,000. They lived unaware of the catastrophe unfolding just a few miles away. The explosion at 1:23 a.m. caused a violent release of radioactive material and released 40 years' worth of energy in just one night. It would take weeks before the true extent of the damage was understood. 30 people died from acute radiation sickness in the days following the disaster, but the radiation effects would extend across generations. The immediate consequences were staggering. Over 100,000 people were evacuated, and the city of Pripyat, once home to the workers of the plant, was abandoned forever. Thousands of workers, known as liquidators, risked their lives to contain the crisis.
Along with the 30 initial deaths, the long-term effects of radiation exposure would lead to thousands of cancers, birth defects, and an entire generation left with irreversible health issues. But perhaps the greatest violation was the denial of the basic right to health and safety. Within 36 hours of the accident, 100,000 people were evacuated from contaminated areas, but many were not given the opportunity to properly prepare for what they would lose: their homes, their communities, their livelihoods. The right to information to be fully informed about the risks was not upheld. And even the evacuation, many would face the challenge of starting over in the face of uncertainty. In the wake of the Chernobyl disaster, one of the most egregious failures was the lack of transparency and accountability by the Soviet government. The USSR initially downplayed the severity of the explosion, delaying evacuations and failing to inform the population of imminent danger. The rights of citizens to be informed and protected were overridden by a government more concerned with maintaining its image than safeguarding public health. This failure of governance left citizens at risk and exposed the broader issue of accountability in state-run operations.
At the time, the citizens were told to keep quiet. The Soviet government didn't want to admit how bad it was. People continued to live in contaminated zones because the authorities didn't want them to cause panic. It was not until much later that the world knew the true extent of the disaster. The international community, too, had a role to play. When the Swedish authorities recorded high levels of radiation, the global nuclear community was forced to confront the reality of Chernobyl and what had happened. The disaster would become a rallying cry for the greater international oversight and the creation of a better safety standard. After Chernobyl, the International Atomic Energy Agency and other international bodies were pushed to improve nuclear safety regulations and push for greater transparency. But citizens still questioned whether they could ever fully trust governments and institutions to take necessary precautions to protect the people in the face of such monumental risks.
The environment, too, bears the scars of Chernobyl. The exclusion zone, a 30-kilometer radius around the reactor, remains one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Forests, lakes, and animals were contaminated, and many of these areas will remain uninhabitable for generations. Entire ecosystems were disrupted. Radiation affects not just humans, but also animals and plants. The contamination of the land was vast, and the long-term effects of that radiation will continue to unfold. For those who lived through the disaster, the fight for justice continues. Many of the survivors have not been properly compensated for their suffering. They have fought for years to be recognized, to receive the medical attention and financial support they need. It's an ongoing battle to get the rights they deserve. The Russian government and intentional organizations continue to face pressure to provide compensation, healthcare, and support to those still living with the aftermath. But for many, the scars of Chernobyl are more than just physical. They are a symbol of broken trust, a call for accountability, and a reminder that the rights of individuals must never be overlooked in the pursuit of power. The disaster raised critical questions about rights and responsibilities in nuclear energy management. The rights of affected individuals included access to accurate information, medical care, and compensation for damages caused by radiation exposure. However, the Soviet government initially withheld information, violating the public's rights to transparency and safety. The responsibilities fell on both government authorities and nuclear industry professionals to ensure strict safety protocols, timely evacuations, and long-term environmental and health monitoring. The disaster highlighted the need for global accountability in handling nuclear technology, reinforcing the importance of international cooperations, stringent regulations, and ethical responsibility in preventing future catastrophes. Chernobyl remains a stark reminder of the complexities surrounding nuclear energy, the responsibilities of those who wield it, and the rights of those it affects. Chernobyl highlights the role of governments and institutions during a crisis, and the rights of those affected. Chernobyl also highlights the environmental and ethical challenges in the ongoing fight for justice. The catastrophe not only exposed the dire consequences of negligence and misinformation, but also underscored the necessity of transparency, accountability, and rigorous safety standards. The rights of those affected, workers, citizens, and future generations, it becomes clear that ensuring nuclear safety is not just a technical obligation, but a moral one. The lessons of Chernobyl must continue to shape our policies and decisions, reminding us that with great power comes an even greater duty to protect life, the environment, and the truth.
На Чернобыльской атомной электростанции произошла авария. Поврежден один из атомных реакторов. Принимаются меры по ликвидации последствий.